So for this video, I wanted to talk about the three large AAA exploration games that I've played this year. That's Baldur's Gate, Hogwarts Legacy, and Starfield. Now, as far as whether these are good games or not, I think they are all fine enough. They excel at different things, and it's basically a case of opinion, with most people assuming Baldur's Gate is the best and Starfield being the weakest. I'm not going to argue that. However, I am going to compare them in their different categories, and then you can essentially, if you want to choose one and not the other, maybe this list will help you out, or maybe you just want to hear my opinions about how they factor against each other in different categories. So there are a number of sections I'm going to use, and of course the video will have chapters in case you just want to look at something specific. So to keep this short, let's start right away. Now the first chapter will be Inheritance or Expectations. Each of these titles is coming from either a developer or an IP that comes with a lot of baggage, right? They have some kind of legacy to keep up with. Harry Potter, of course, is the baggage that Hogwarts Legacy has to deal with, both positive and negative. This is a huge universe that a lot of people have read these books and know exactly what is expected to come within this universe. Most of us know how the magic works and how the lore works and what the spells are called, and basically how things are meant to look in our imagination. So this game had to essentially get all this and put it into video game form and present it in a way that is acceptable to the customers. Baldur's Gate 3 has two pieces of legacy to live up to. The first is that it has to be the sequel to Baldur's Gate 2, which was one of the greatest RPGs ever released. I mentioned it in my Pillars of Eternity game review a few years ago. It's one of the greatest. And it has to also be a technological sequel to Divinity Original Sin 2 because it's carrying Larian Studios' engine forward. So definitely a lot of big shoes to fill. Starfield is Bethesda's first original IP in decades, so it has that baggage going for it. A lot of people's eyes are definitely on the game because with Fallout 76 being the last thing that Bethesda released, a lot of eyes are on the studio to see how it performs. So all these games had a lot of pressure coming in terms of what is expected from them. I will say that in terms of delivering, for the most part, they all basically delivered what they were expected to. I would say that two of them have two contentions, right? Hogwarts Legacy does not offer as much choice as was initially hinted at, and Starfield's exploration is not nearly as interesting as it was hinted at being. So those two have that to deal with, but for the most part, I think they were able to land without controversy. We don't have a Cyberpunk or a Last of Us 2 scenario where the game comes out and does a huge bait and switch and turns out to be something completely different from what was marketed. We don't have those kind of controversies or shenanigans going on with these games. The launches were basically clean for the most part, which is good. So let's go ahead and look at the gameplay now. So, the criteria that I'm using to judge this section is essentially the agency, the mechanical feedback, the options that the player has in combat, exploration, mini games, puzzles, all that kind of stuff. In this area, Hogwarts Legacy is by far the best. The combat is very action-based, mobility-based. You have a lot of options in terms of gadgets, which are represented by plants. You have a lot of spells to choose from. It has the Arkham Knight counter-attack kind of thing. You have to watch out for lots of enemies. They have color-based shields that you have to deal with. It has a lot of ways to engage the player and get you to do different things and keep you on your toes, So it is, in my opinion, the most engaging one by far. Baldur's Gate, unfortunately, is the weakest in this area due to the very nature of the game that it is. It's a turn-based game. It does have a lot of options through the classes, the powers that you have, the abilities. You can use the environment because of the Divinity original scene engine. You can use enemies against each other. You can create environmental effects. All this stuff still exists, but this is a losing battle. This type of game unfortunately cannot win against the action games if we're talking about mechanical feedback and engagement of the player. Even if it was an RTS or one of those telltale games like the Walking Dead games, they would always lose this kind of category. I love turn-based games. I've played Final Fantasy and Pokemon my whole life, but I have to be realistic. The appeal to these kinds of games is more on a strategic tactical level. It's not on a mechanical feedback level. On that level, definitely these games cannot win this kind of category. Also, I do not like the dice rolling mechanic that's involved in Baldur's Gate. When you're doing things like speech checks, lock picking, and the like, I personally prefer hard stat checks like Divinity Original Sin 2 hard. What I mean is that if my dialogue skill is 8, and the check for that persuasion is 6, I should be able to get it instead of again having to roll a dice to make it work. Though I understand that was done because this is Dungeons and Dragons and they roll dice in Dungeons and Dragons, so that's how it has to be. Starfield is the one that I would call mid. The guns are fun enough. Some of the powers received in the game make combat interesting. But for the most part, just like with the previous games that are in this engine, enemies seem mostly unresponsive and unaware of their environment. They move around a little bit, but they don't use cover very well, and it just seems like the AI is limited. It's difficult for me to put it into words. Maybe I just don't have the right language, but I know what it feels like because I've played a lot of Bethesda games, and it's just that same feeling. The one of the advantages this time round is that enemies can use verticality, especially because some of them have like jetpacks, so they can kind of move around. It adds a little bit of dynamism, but you can see through it. They are not moving around to do anything interesting. It's just to create the illusion that they're doing something. Sometimes enemies run away and it genuinely doesn't feel like it's worth it to even chase them. As soon as they gain a certain distance, the AI will reset and they'll just go back to whatever they were doing. It's one of those things where if you look very closely at it, you begin to see into how the cookie is made or into how the sausage is made. I think that's the expression, and it just kind of ruins it. Um, yeah, it's one of those things that's best if you don't think too much about it. When the game started, I tried, for me personally, I tried to play a melee build. That's what I wanted to do. So I started out trying to punch enemies and I put in the skills that I thought would assist me, which was health and damage resistance. But a lot of the other skills that I needed in order to make this work was so far down the chain that in order for me to get them, I would have to pump a lot of skills into that tree, and then the skills always come with these annoying challenges that you have to do if you want to upgrade them even further. It's a system that seems to be designed to waste your time, and I will come back to this later regarding Starfield. But the entire design philosophy of the game seems to be to waste your time, and I'm sorry. I want to play in Baldur's Gate. I can just pick a monk and just play unarmed combat, whereas with Starfield you have to waste I don't know how many hours before you can eventually be allowed to play this kind of build. In terms of puzzles and mini games, Hogwarts Legacy again blows the others far out of the water that there is no comparison. From its many different mini games, races, physics-based puzzles where you move boulders around, their location-based search and find type quests, the devs really push their engine to make various encounters within the different little systems that they had. The other two are basically just using the walk up and click to interact kind of thing. Baldur's Gate has this section where you're doing shadow hearts quest, or rather before Shadowheart's quest regarding her spear, you have to go through these trials within the Dark Justicia area in the Underdark, and I hate that section. That's the only time the game engages in puzzles, and it's terrible. I would rather there were just no puzzles in the game. Its mechanics just do not make it work really well. I did not like it at all. In fact, I wish in future playthroughs there was a way to skip that section. If someone ever introduces a mod that can skip it, I will definitely be installing that so I don't have to repeat that puzzle section. It's not something that I personally find enjoyable. Then next up, let's move to presentation. So in this section, I'm referring to graphics, animations, cutscenes, world design, the way the game looks, basically. This one's an easy one, but from the other way around. Rather than discussing which is the best, it's much easier to identify which one is the worst. And that's because Starfield loses this one by a country mile. In terms of facial animations, model definition, and things like that, the other two games are just leagues ahead of Starfield. Baldur's Gate far more than Hogwarts Legacy, but definitely the other two games are in a whole different league. They are much better to look at. In what seems to be born from some kind of need to maintain their game engine, Bethesda once again returns to this close-up, face center, dialogue interaction camera, and I think this was just a bad idea. Hogwarts Legacy and Baldur's Gate both employ cinematic cutaways whenever necessary to enhance their action, to punctuate certain sequences, and I think they both benefit greatly from this. Starfield always maintains the same camera angle no matter what is happening. It only changes it in very, very rare moments, like when your ship is blasting off, and if you're playing third person, then that doesn't really, just slightly changes the angle at which the ship is at, but you were already looking at it in third person. And I think the other two games greatly benefit from this kind of approach. I think Starfield should have also changed this, but it looks like a limitation that is within that engine. Also, there is no way around it. The character models of Starfield just look ugly. Like, Hogwarts Legacy doesn't have the best looking ones either, but they are definitely far better rendered and animated than those of Starfield. In this area, Baldur's Gate 3 comes far ahead of the others because its characters both look better and animate really well in comparison to the other two. In terms of lighting, all the three games are good, but because even Starfield's models definitely get improved under the right lighting. But for the most part, I think Baldur's Gate 3 still wins this one out. It just has the best looking characters and models across the board, be it main or side characters. Now, finally, in terms of environmental design, I would give it to Hogwarts Legacy. I think considering the amount of detail that's placed into the models in the area, not the characters, but like the general buildings and the structures and the little things you can find moving around, like armor sets, paintings, plants, and generally artifacts that you can find all over. Going into the Hogsmeade region alone just has so much visual nourishment, if I'm to call it that. There's just so much interesting little stuff to see. It's just a lot of small details that they put across this entire world that are really, really cool to see. I think they definitely win out when it comes to environmental design. Let's take a look at technical issues. Now, all these games have had some technical issues, as is unfortunately what we normally expect from huge AAA games on PC these days. Now, in this area, the lowest offender is Hogwarts Legacy, with only a few select areas that lower FPS for seemingly no reason. Others like Hogsmeade are easy to understand due to how, there's a lot of stuff going on in that area. Sometimes the game will also fail to load the next assets in time, even if you have an SSD, and then you have to experience a small immersion breaking loading icon as you transition from the internal spaces of the castle back to the exterior. But it lasts like a second, it's not a big deal. So it's not likely to ruin your experience. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 runs pretty well until you get into Act 3, starting with the Rivington area. because at this point the game basically starts to lose its shit. This specific game is the one that got me to finally get an SSD, which, yes, I obviously should have done by now. But the game holds up well enough on a hard drive before you get to Act 3. You may not think that you actually need it, but trust me, once you get to that point, the game starts to lose its mind. You will get to points where entire buildings do not load up. You have a cutscene play out from beginning to end before the buildings are able to load into the scene. And so there's a lot of empty space all around the place. I eventually looked these issues up and found out that, they're universally experienced problems starting from the third act. So I waited for a few patches to roll out, and while they definitely led to some improvements, the overall technical experience remains pretty unstable beyond the second act of the game. I saw people talking about how great the game is, but anyone that did not mention these technical issues, to me it looks like they did not play this game beyond its second act before slapping together a review and putting it out. Like, I don't blame them, the game is pretty long, but this kind of stuff happens a lot. So if the problems are later in the game, you can't see them in reviews because the people reviewing the games did not get that far into the game. There is also this weird dip in FPS whenever you enter like a dialogue option, because there's a camera switch that happens whenever you enter dialogue options, and there's a serious frame dip that happens at that point. If you are having a graphics card or your frame rate is above 60 all the time, then you will not notice this, because if it drops, it still remains above 60 FPS, so it seems a bit smoother. If, however, your frame rate is a bit closer to 60, when it does this switch, you will dip below 30 FPS, and then you will notice that hitch. So I noticed this because I've played the game on two graphics cards, and on the stronger one, there's nothing much that looks suspicious, but on the weaker one, there's definitely always a hitch every time you enter dialogue. This gets much worse once you enter the third act, like everything else, and it's just something to notice. They've still not been able to fix this to this date. If you have weaker hardware, it's definitely something that's quite jarring, especially for a game that involves a lot of dialogue. So, just something to note. The worst of all when it comes to technical issues is Starfield. For some reason that I cannot explain or find a solid, definitive explanation for online, this game is very demanding to even the most powerful of hardware. It's almost impossible to play without upscaling technology, making it the latest in a series of games released this year that seem to only work optimally when you have one of the upscaling technologies like FSR or DLSS employed. And even then, they didn't bother to put in DLSS. People had to mod it into the game. That's for the NVIDIA people. I've currently switched to AMD, so I can only use FSR. But all the same, people should not have to mod this into the game. I don't see why Bethesda didn't put it in. There's also been a number of quality of life improvements that people have put in with mods. I haven't tested them myself, but I know this is standard for Bethesda, but not this year. Like, not this year. There's so much competition this year for good AAA games. I don't think they can afford to indulge in these kind of shenanigans. The current GPU that I'm using, it pushes some pretty high FPS at 1080p for both Hogwarts Legacy and Baldur's Gate at their maximum settings. But even on medium with FSR, so I'm rendering at a much lower setting than 1080p itself, I still can barely get above 60 FPS. If I'm to go really high in an area that's mostly barren with nothing going on, I can maybe go 10 to 15 FPS above that. Beyond that, I cannot get any FPS higher than that. I don't know what's going on with the game. I am assuming there's a lot of background activity going on in the engine, because this kind of taxation on the hardware does not translate into anything that the player can see. So I don't understand why it's so taxing. It doesn't load really quickly. So I'm still not certain what the game is using all the hardware for, but it's definitely very taxing and it's just not ideal. Let's talk about exploration next. This is the one that I find as the most contentious of the three games that we are going to discuss, because everyone believes these games all have exploration, and so it depends on what you're referring to. So let's first describe what it means to me. Now, when I game, I want to know that if I look around and go off the beaten path, and it's not a linear game, the process will first of all be enjoyable, and that I will find interesting things. I don't just mean quests, it could be story things, it could be visual things, they're just anything interesting once I go off the beaten path. All these three games provide that ability. You can't go off the main questing path and go around and do other things, and there will be things to find. In my opinion, Baldur's Gate 3 has the most rewarding finds, as these tend to be interesting characters, sometimes just interesting conversations, sometimes entire storylines or subquests, and these are really well written, and a lot of the time you find optional paths and mechanics to deal with existing and future quests. So, Hogwarts Legacy provides mostly standard open world Ubisoft type stuff. You will find dungeons with chests, collectibles, mini games, and various map markers that you basically just go around ticking off. Where it excels, however, is in the visual exploration. Due to the incredible world design that I mentioned before, walking or flying around the environment almost always rewards you with very interesting things to see. So walking around the castle and the various areas will often lead you to find various little interactions going on between NPCs and different objects, and these are likely to make you smile even though they may not have any immediate contribution to the game stats themselves. Starfield also provides the standard open world stuff like dungeons, enemy outposts, and so on, but this one in particular takes a major hit to the experience due to the method through which this exploration happens. Getting to any new planet requires hopping through multiple loading screens, and in addition to this, once you're on the planet, you must then slowly traverse the landscape to whatever objective you're trying to get to in the distance, and usually with 99% of the time, there will be nothing between you and that objective. You just press forward for minutes at a time while you jump around or you try and sprint, and due to the short sprint time that you have, until eventually you upgrade your oxygen if you choose to put your skills into the fitness attribute, it's just painful to engage in this game's exploration mechanic. This game would definitely have benefited from having some sort of vehicle that players can use when they get to planets like the Mako from Mass Effect. Whenever I took a break from the main quest in Starfield, I always had to have something else to play or listen to, like a podcast or a YouTube video, just so that I could feel the many minutes it was going to take for me to get to the final destination. Also, all three of these games use repeated assets, as with most large games, obviously. Baldur's Gate 3 does it mostly just for the camping area, with each region having the same camp area that you use. Otherwise, all its main and side quests are individually crafted. Every NPC is individually modeled and given their own voice assets for whatever they tell you. Hogwarts Legacy does the same thing for its dungeons, the little dungeons you come across as you travel. If you do a lot of these, you'll start to notice many of them have the same small interior area every time you get into them, so you'll begin to become familiar with that one. The minigames, of course, use the same mechanic for most of them, although they are spread out quite well, and they use the environment to vary up what you have to do to make it work. Which I think is fair. We can't really expect them to build 50 or so different mechanics for every single puzzle that's in the game. I think that would be a bit unreasonable, and I think it works fine the way it is. However, for their side quests, every single character is individually designed. They each have an individual name, a little story attached to them. Each of them is personally designed and voice acted and given their own little quest. There are some generic students and resident models around, but those are just environmental flavor, and they do not engage with the player avatar directly, so you don't have to worry about those ones. Starfield, however, takes this repeated assets idea and basically graph jumps to the next galaxy with it. Outside of the main settlements like New Atlantis and Neon, nearly everything else is using recycled assets. Almost every artifact cave that you will find looks exactly the same as all the others. And they all have that single starbone that's waiting for you at the center, always appearing in the same place. There is this lab that you find, which depending on how long you play this game, you will see this same lab like hundreds of times. So many of the assets, due to procedure generation, are placed in locations that make no sense at all. You're meant to be discovering these ancient temple structures, but when you get there, sometimes they are just within direct eye line of other human operations, yet no one seems to notice them except you. Of course, because it's a Bethesda game, there are also a lot of these Radiant quests. You remember Preston Garvey from Fallout 4 with the Minutemen quests? So that type of quest, one which can be auto-generated by the system and basically given to you indefinitely as if it's an MMO. I wanted to see everything within the Alpha Centauri system when I first started. So I decided to check out all the little icons on the planets that are around that system. But after doing 2 of them, I checked out mining colonies, and each of them had an NPC give me a mission where they told me about how they had of a mining deposit nearby, and they needed me to go and check out the ore to determine its viability, and then keep whatever I found, and then bring the results back to them. These mines are so far away that it takes you so long to get there. And then on the way back, at least you can fast travel. But after doing this twice, I was like, I'm done. I never went to another mining outpost again. And I knew that I'm not going to engage with this type of mission again. Again, I'll repeat this. It's like it's designed to just waste your time. I don't know why they're treating the game like it's some kind of online MMO. There's so many choices this year when it comes to AAA games. I don't understand why you would choose to make yours so time-wasting. The other games respect the player's time. They understand people have to go play Spider-Man or whatever. They can't just sit indefinitely repeating silly, pointless missions forever. Moving on. The next idea is the concept, the IP, the originality. This one I give to Starfield. Starfield was the only one that had an original story that you get to explore. And also it has the most potential when it comes to the lore. Because this is new and it still has many different directions it can go. Not that the others can't tell interesting stories, but they are of course limited within what their stories can do. There are actually times when playing Hogwarts Legacy that I felt like it could have been a bit punchier or a bit more gritty, but it can't because it's tied to the Harry Potter universe, and therefore it's kind of age restricted and they can't do certain things with it. Baldur's Gate, of course, also has to operate within that universe and can't really deviate outside of what the other material is doing. So this one at least has the greatest potential in terms of where it can go. They leave a lot of unanswered questions within this game, and I'm very curious to see where they will end up going in whichever material they end up taking it to. Now, that's just the concept. So, let's talk about story, writing, characters. In terms of the story, writing, characters, I think Baldur's Gate 3 gets a very easy win here. The team manages to make each of the characters within this game memorable and interesting from the start. The main plot itself is also pretty decent, though the side quests are what I found to be the most interesting, as I almost always do in games like this, be it The Witcher or whatever. I usually find side quests to be the most interesting types. The same applies to Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield. I think the Crimson Fleet quest in Starfield is the best one, and I think Sebastian Sallow's quest is the best one in Hogwarts Legacy. Now, to summarize quickly, I think Baldur's Gate 3 has the best writing and characters. I think Starfield has the most unique and different concept, although it takes a much longer time to get going, and I nearly quit and didn't experience some of the best parts. In order to see some of the most interesting stuff in Starfield, you actually have to finish the game and then do New Game Plus, which is just unfortunate. Like I said, again, for the third time I repeat it, the game, there seems to be some overconfidence within these devs as to how much time people would spend in this game. Like, to see the best stuff, you have to put a lot of hours into this game. But I'm not going to harp on that any further. It's a very interesting way to do it, and it has a lot of must-see moments that are genuinely very, very cool. Hogwarts Legacy is the weakest in this particular area. I found neither its main story, villains, side characters, or anybody to be really interesting. There is one interesting quest line, as I mentioned, with the character Sebastian. The rest, in my opinion, are extremely forgettable. Possibly this is because it is the most PG of the games, and therefore the writers are forced to hold back in order to play within the Harry Potter universe kind of rules. To me, everything is just bleh in regards to its story. It's mostly in its mechanics and the world itself that I find Hogwarts Legacy to thrive. In this particular area, story writing, characters, bland. I think everything about it is forgettable. For the final sector, we are going to look at choices. By this, I mean consequences to your action, to the actions. How do the things that you do or not do affect the world, the story, the characters, and perhaps even the endings of the game? Hogwarts Legacy here is the weakest, so let's start there. Nothing you say in this game changes the general direction of the story or the world that you inhabit. You cannot change the fates of characters. You cannot affect the state of the world. Even learning the forbidden curses like Avada Kedavra to kill people means nothing, as no one reacts to you using them. You cannot get in trouble for using Alohomora in public to unlock, people's houses. Stealth only matters if you choose to use it for combat, and outside of very specific quests where you're forced to use it, and of course if you don't use it, you get a fail state if you're spotted. Stealth just doesn't matter. So and personally, I don't even like it because I find it faster and more engaging to just roll up and just blast everyone in the face. So refusing to do quests does not fail them. They will always be open until you decide to do them. There are only 2 points in the game at which you make a choice. Once in the Sebastian quest I mentioned, and the other is right at the end of the game. Neither are mentioned again after you do them, so they don't even matter beyond the very moment when you do them. So it's best to just think of the choice in this game as being related to combat. You choose how you fight, basically. That's where the choice in the game is. Starfield has a lot more story choice in its quests, although it's usually binary, as is mostly the case with Bethesda games. Whether you're going to side with one group or the other, whether you're going to kill this person or not kill them, whether you're going to side with refugees or the oppressors, whether you're going to side with pirates or the collection. It's almost always just one or the other, binary choices. And so it's not bad. I mean, a lot of quests do it this way, and it wouldn't be a problem if this was not 2023 and it was not the year in which we got Baldur's Gate. So if you want to experiment with choices, Baldur's Gate 3 is the dream game. Right from character creation, class selection, companion selection, everything is optional and contributes directly to your options in combat, dialogue, story, and whichever approach you choose to get, you take to get there. There are a few major endings with multiple variant epilogue clips. A variety of characters can live or die. Some won't even appear in later chapters based on what you did previously. The game will still proceed. Some characters only appear if you choose specific classes and do specific things, like there's a character that appears if you break your oath as a paladin. Choosing one of your origin characters at the start majorly affects your dialogue options, like the Dark Urge. It affects your combat options because you get more options for combat that you wouldn't have otherwise. Your cutscenes get affected. Your relationships with many of the villains and the characters get affected. So as far as the term RPG role-playing is concerned, Baldur's Gate 3 might be the greatest achievement we've had at this kind of AAA level. There are smaller games like Disco Elysium that have lots of choices in terms of dialogue and what you can do, but none of those is like on this large AAA scale. So at this level, there's definitely nothing that competes with Baldur's Gate on the market currently. If you want to experiment with role playing, it definitely does not get any better than this. And unfortunately, we have to put things in context, right? We all remember that Forspoken's failure made Hi-Fi Rush look good. And likewise, Baldur's Gate's presence makes Starfield look even worse than it would otherwise. We have to acknowledge that. So yeah, that's how I think these games stack up against each other. I think Hogwarts Legacy has the best gameplay, world design, and technical state. I think Starfield attempts the most creative idea in terms of how to handle its new game pluses, but it is definitely, in my opinion, the weaker of the three games. And overall, I think Baldur's Gate 3 has the best all around package, and it has the best writing, characters, story, choices, as well as the best graphics, I guess, in terms of character design and how it looks. From a character standpoint, Hogwarts Legacy has the best in terms of environmental graphics. So, exploration, I think, is a tie between Hogwarts Legacy and Baldur's Gate. Hogwarts Legacy has the best visual exploration. Baldur's Gate 3 has the best quest-based exploration around. So yeah, that's if you've somehow managed to make it this far. Thanks for watching. I appreciate, and take care.